Hello. Let me begin my second part of the discussion. In the earlier part, I talked about the Western values and how rigid and absolute they were, how the status quo system was followed, that almost became a paradigm to be followed, etc. So on and so forth. I have spoken about them. Let me just take a look at how theoretically the syncretic idea may work vis-a-vis theatrical practices. So we know that the sanitized kind of an idea that I was talking about, that everything has to go back to status quo, it has to be absolutely the powers that be, the establishment would be re-established, that we have seen. And what syncretic theatre can do is go beyond that, and it can represent a different kind of order altogether, a more equal, more let's say democratic kind of an order where multiple voices can exist. If you allow two or more different ideas to coexist, then you are automatically allowing multiple voices. You automatically allow the possibility of having multiple voices. I mean, you can always repress, suppress, which is very easy. In fact, the anti-colonial beginning that I was talking about, that we often talk about, that needed this kind of multipleness, this kind of absence of a single-minded ideological presence. That was the idea with which syncretic theatre is beginning. Now, what we have is once again a possibility of multiple paradigms, because India being such a country full of diversity and so many cultures coexisting, you cannot have one classical model of syncretism. Each and every region will demand its own model, and syncretism can actually bring together the new Western ideas and these old cultural tropes, these old cultural ideas, and they are creating these new elements of theatre. And let me talk about how that can be done. Let me talk about how that can be seen and read, how that can be, in fact, instituted. And then I will, in the third part of the discussion, I'll come back to the people who are working with such paradigms. Now, what happens is, the idea is of a balance. You bring two or more ideas together and you present them in a balanced way. That is vital, because you can have folk elements within a Western kind of model, but they will only remain elements. They might not become major elements. The Western theatrical model might be the dominating model, the dominant model, and the others might come as stray elements or experimentations which will integrate themselves with the primary model. So that's not what syncretic theatre is about. Syncretic theatre is more about balance, giving due prominence to both of these ideas. So that is very, very important. That demands a different kind of construction of the plot, of the acting, the presentation of that plot, the kind of dialogue delivery in each and everything. You will need a completely different model as such. So this, and sometimes what happens is, there are playwrights who remove these Western models, these Western tropes, these Western elements entirely. and they go back to one of the classical Indian traditions, classical indigenous traditions available, and they present theatre in that mode. That is not syncretic theatre, because in that kind of a theatre we are actually going back to the earlier times. So we are not really balancing, or we are not really amalgamating or fusing multiple traditions. We are merely rejecting one and choosing the other. And as I started by telling you, resistance to this concept of the other is one of the primary things that syncretic theatre does. That this kind of cultural otherization, that is something to be spoken against which syncretic theatre is trying to raise its voice. So these colonial markers and the colonial markers, the colonial paradigms, the new Western paradigms. I mean, you can take a look at the theatre of the absurd, and you can have an amalgamation with the contemporary Indian ideas, older classical Indian traditions. But that would be an experiment, that would be syncretism, but whether that will work or not is a different question. That would be where the perception and reception point will come to play. So that would be a very interesting thing to see, in fact, if such it can become completely absurd or it can work. It depends entirely on the people who are constructing the text. So, but like in many cases, what we have is that we see regional, say for instance, traditional dances integrated within the body of the performance. It is performance after all. So those dances come in, and through those dances, through those postures, poses, mudras, etc., a lot of things can be said which verbal representation may not be able to. So that is more often than not used nowadays. It's not only the musical theatre that I am talking about. It would be something like Habib Tanveer's Charandas Chor, and you will see how a lot of folk elements are seeping in, and they are integrated within the structure of the play. They are vitally important to the so-called meaning that the play is trying to construct. So that is vital, this amalgamation that I am talking about. And in many ways, you can replace dialogue with gestural elements. You can replace dialogues with dance, and these things happen. In fact, I will just give you the definition of total theatre. Jean-Louis Barros's total theatre. Sometimes people have compared this idea of syncretic theatre with that kind of a total theatre. And if that was the case, then we would have called it total theatre. We would not have called it syncretic theatre, because the politics behind this theatre, the purpose behind this theatre is quite different. So we need to remember that. We need to remember this distinction between the two. So that total theatre, just take a look at the definition. And one of the major ways syncretism is introduced is by introducing a lot of local, traditional, mythological elements. Indigenous mythology. So that kind of mythologizing is necessary, because mythology is something that is very close to the population of a culture, that is very near the population, and it's a part of life. I mean, for a very large number of people, epics, if they are present in the culture, they become very significant. If they are surviving in that culture, then they become very important. and they become a part of life. They even become a part of religion. So these mythologies can become significant ideas in syncretic theatre. Agnivarsha, for instance. I already mentioned Agnivarsha earlier. So if you think about it, how elements from an epic is being utilized, and this entire Indianness is being utilized, although the structural elements might be Western. The technical elements might be Western. I mean, you may want to use stage lighting in a Western way, etc., and so on and so forth. But syncretism can be the technical plus the thematic. That is also possible. But having said that, I am going to contradict myself, because even in the technical aspects, the introduction of indigenous classical elements are necessary in order to create a new model of drama. Otherwise, it would be merely something presented through Western traditions, something Indian presented through Western traditions. It would be kind of Westernization, perhaps. I'm sure some of you would disagree with this, and I would welcome these disagreements. I will welcome any dialogue that is possible. That is one of the points of having a course like this, where exchanges would be happening, where disagreements would be happening, where you think and you respond to all the speakers, or most of the speakers, or some of the speakers like me, who would say things and would demand controversy or challenges. So that is possible. So, and what happens is, the use of mythology is important because somehow or the other, mythology speaks more closely than history. Because history, at the end of the day, is quite often politically presented. The politics of history is not unknown to us. How history is manipulated by certain hegemonic ideas, that is quite familiar to us. So instead of dealing with history, political history, mythological stories, mythological ideas can often communicate better with an audience. The audience is always important. When you are studying theatre, you need to remember that not all plays work well with all audiences. I mean, you have to understand, it's not a cultural highbrow, lowbrow gap, but a core cultural kind of a gap. Not everybody, I mean, if you think about it, the theatre of the absurd was not really popular here. There were experimentations, but they remained experimentations. They did not really become a rage, or not quite like it had its run in the West. But it did not really launch a good launch here. So not everything, but coming back to the syncretic idea, these dance patterns, the use of mythology. Often people can use non-actors in the sense, I'm not saying they're not performers. They might be performers as in dancers, they might be people who recite, but they may not be professional actors. They may not even be actors, they might be common people who come on the stage, and there can be experiments with that kind of a response. But that is not only syncretism, that is also a kind of an experimental theatre, a kind of a post-dramatic theatre that we are now thinking about, we are now looking forward to. So, the introduction of other performers becomes significant because the Western paradigm has depended largely on words. Once again, there have been experiments, there have been other kinds of presentations, but if you look at the mainstream tradition of Western theatre, then words have been, the drama portion have been very, very significant. But in syncretic theatre, the drama portion would be, the written text would be significant, but the written text does not have to be represented orally. It can be represented bodily as well. So the presence of other performers, other kinds of performances can ensure this bodily representation, and when you have these bodily representations, then you are coming closer to your own cultural construction, your own very recognizable cultural representations. Language does not remain that important. It's a different kind of a theatre language that can exist here. So, and the common things like costumes, that's fine. I mean, we are familiar with costumes. We know how costumes can be manipulated and they can become something else if you expect. You can always use traditional Indian costumes. You can always take a classic Western text and represent it through such traditional modes, through dancing, through perhaps Kathakali Manved, and these are all there. It's not like there have not been such syncretic experiments. They are all there, and there have been different kinds of presentations, not only translations, but in a way, if we are talking about the text only, then they become transcreations. Not only translations or adaptations even, but they become transcreations. So such transcreations can lead to good syncretic presence. So that one can think about. In fact, one idea that comes from this involvement of the body, the hyper involvement of the body, is that it challenges the early 20th century ideas of naturalism and realism. That has been there. I mean, there have been people who have said that if we need to do naturalism and realism, we can always see cinema. Theatre can be more. Theatre doesn't have to be ultra realistic. Theatre can be the kind of the seat of something greater, a greater kind of performance. So once again, these have been voices that have talked about different paradigms, new paradigms, and tried to create new paradigms. Some have succeeded, some have not. But in India, we have had quite a bit of success. But the one example that I can remember is some time back. I would give you the dates and everything in a slide. This experimental theatre, this Tim Supple's A Midsummer Night's Dream, was wonderful because it was in 7 languages. 7 languages. Not all languages had equal time or equal space, but English, Tamil, Hindi, Bengali, Sinhalese, I think, and a few more languages were there. They were utilized, and there were no translations presented. There were no subtitles. I mean, this was a performance, so subtitles were not there. And it's not only me. I mean, we who are familiar with the text of A Midsummer Night's Dream, we would not have much difficulty understanding what is going on. But I did talk to a number of people who did not belong to the innate fraternity. They were laymen, as I had earlier labeled them, these laymen. I talked to quite a few, and they said they had no problem understanding what was going on, because it was not only the dialogue that they were performing with. They were dancing, they were using gymnastics, they were using various different kind of folk bodily performances. So it makes sense. So you need not depend entirely on words. Other tropes are there, other tropes are available, and they can make, if not complete, partial sense. So Tim Supple's experiment was a brilliant experiment, and it was done in the open. So it worked brilliantly in the open. Later on, they performed it in a picture frame stage, and it did not have the impact that it had when it was done in the open. So that was a brilliant kind of an experiment, and I don't know whether you will have a few snippets of it on YouTube, but on that small YouTube screen, I don't know what kind of resolution they are in, it would not seem very impressive. But if you had seen the ultra large stage that was created, it was not a picture frame stage, it only had the back wall, it was open on three sides, and it was huge. And that hugeness was utilized when they were presenting the supernatural, when they were presenting the queen and the king of the fairies, and the larger than life ideas that were supposed to come in. So they did that brilliantly, and that openness and that presentation at night was absolutely brilliant. So I am not saying that that was a kind of a syncretic theatre, but that was an experiment that can be a model for syncretism. In fact, why can I not call it syncretism? Because they were using the Western text, but they were presenting it in multiple indigenous, presenting it through multiple indigenous traditional performance elements. So that is a kind of syncretism. That may not be the Indian theatrical syncretism that we speak of, but that definitely was a kind of syncretic theatre, and it could be read as such, definitely. Now, the problem is that when we are studying theatre, whether we like it or not, we are ultimately, at the end of the day, bound by Aristotelian principles. We go back to that. We go back to the rigidity of the Aristotelian, formulae. I'm not going to say that he told us that this is how theatre should be. Nobody can tell us that. Art is nobody's property. There can be a kind of a grammar, but that grammar does not have to be rigid. And we go back to Aristotle. We rarely go back to Natyashastra. Natyashastra can give us another paradigm, which, once again, we do not have to rigidly follow that. We do not have to look at all the bhava rasa elements. And as per the slide, there are all these elements, and Natya Shastra is, of course, very rigid. It gives you practically no freedom to interpret. You have to perform it in the way prescribed. But we can look at it. We can take ideas from it. We can amalgamate it, and we do not have to obey Aristotle blindly. Not that we do. We no longer do that. But somewhere, whenever you are studying theatre, we start with Aristotle. We start talking about theatre with Aristotle. We never talk about Natya Shastra and any other theatrical formulae that might be there in different parts of the world. Somehow, whenever we are taking theatre, we go back to Aristotle. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, yes, we are supposed to learn a variety of things, but we should not be dependent on that particular thing only. So, that is the other idea. When we are studying theatre, that kind of a syncretic approach is also very, very necessary. It's not only possible, but it's necessary. And this is what our playwrights have been giving us. In fact, the four, in fact, people that I will be talking about, definitely K. Panikkar from Kerala, and K.S. Kanailal and Ratan Thiam from Manipur, and I will be talking about Rabindranath Tagore a little. So, but that would come in the next part of the discussion. One contemporary production that had amazed me, it's still being produced in Kolkata and around Kolkata. It's called Urubhandam by Monish Mitra, and it's a wonderful experiment with theatre. It depends largely on dancing. It has a lot of dependence on dancing, on bodily performance, on narration. There is a narrator who tells you the story, and the performances happen while the narrator is narrating. So it's not a completely theatrical presentation. Rather, it is something different. It is something that gives you a different kind of a perspective to the very idea of performance. Narration on one side, physical, bodily representation of that narration on the other side of the stage with classical Indian dance forms. Then they break. It's a 6-hour long play with multiple breaks in between. And when you have those breaks, when you go out of the auditorium, you see the performance has not ended. It has not stopped within the auditorium. It has been extended to the foyer. It has been extended to the outer regions, because if there is a war scene, then after the war scene is ending, when you come out, you see bodies strewn out all over the place. Bodies of soldiers, fallen soldiers. So you kind of carry the performances. And that, of course, is experimental, that is not syncretic. But the syncretism happens on the stage when they are using all such multiple such methods of representation. And that's quite brilliant. And let me just stop here. Let me just stop this part here. And you think about these modes. I will just give you a slide containing the few elements that I have mentioned. There are other elements possible. There are other forms possible that one can include. But these few I have mentioned. And please take a look at that. I will come back with the next part.